congregation, and I have the class period this morning. I enjoy the opportunity, and we're studying the life of Christ, and life of Christ in the Waldron book. You might get your Waldron book out. We'll be referring to some of the pages in there, beginning on page 68. Might be reading my course through the period of retirement. Get the electronics here. Is that good, Charlie? Okay. The Waldron book, beginning with the period of retirement, on page 68, and we have the Life of Christ divisions there on the left-hand column of the page. The years of preparation. About how long a period was that, David? 30 years. Yes, and the significant event in years of preparation, Patty?
Jesus baptism? Okay.
No, that's in the next division. Richard?
His birth.
His birth, yes. The advent of the Messiah. Galatians chapter 4 said, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Significant event in the history of this old place that we live on. Then the beginning of the ministry. Let's see if I get this slide up here. The beginning of Jesus' ministry, Farron, was what event?
His baptism.
His baptism, and that's recorded in Matthew 3 and Mark 1 and Luke 22. And I want to talk a little bit about the timing of the life of Jesus, and then the Galilean, great Galilean ministry. Let me ask Janet what would be this is highly something you might pick. I'm trying to think of a word, but anyhow, one of the big significant events of the great Galilean ministry.
Well, I would say call them apostles.
Okay, that's one.
His first miracle, his rejection, and
Landon?
Well, Miss Janet's doing a good job there, but, you know, as far as we're considered, maybe you think about the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, the Sermon on the Mount and choosing the apostles are the two that I personally pick. And, that's just a subjective idea from any of us about that. But those are two significant events. Okay, and when Jesus' ministry began at the baptism of John, it covers in his life the period of 4 Passover feasts, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Passover feast of the Jews were near. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Jesus had begun to call John's disciples to follow him, and they went up into Galilee for a brief stay there, and he did a miracle in Cana, and then they went over to Capernaum, and then they came back for the first Passover. In the first Passover, what was a significant event in the first Passover, Randy? Richard?
We started having opposition from the Pharisees.
I'm thinking about something Jesus personally did.
He healed on the Sabbath day. That caused problems.
Somebody guess what I'm thinking?
Cleanse the temple.
Cleanse the temple is a significant event. I made the question, so I get the picture. He cleansed the temple and at the first Passover. And then the second Passover, Jesus had been on up into Galilee once again, and he went back from Galilee, and he went up to Jerusalem. Scholars say that when it says Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast, that is significant, and it usually indicates a Passover feast. And Jerusalem was higher in altitude than the area of Galilee, and so it's not going north; it's really going south, but it's going up. Okay, and it's second Passover. Just after the second Passover, there was, at the second Passover, Cooper, what is a significant contact that Jesus had at the second Passover? A personal contact. Sandra? Somebody came to see him. Nicodemus. And he, on the way back north, he went through Samaria, and who did he talk to there, Paula? The woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, okay? And so now, it's in the section of Jesus' life we're in now, the first retirement, and it begins at the time of the third Passover after Jesus' ministry started. And that's recorded in John chapter 6 and verse 4. Says, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. And John 6 and 1 begins the introduction of the retirement period of Jesus. Jesus went away to the other side of Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, Bethsaida. Sometimes they say Bethsaida Julius is on the northeast side, and Jesus went over there, and we know that he did a great miracle there, feeding 5,000 people. Well, if the Passover feast of the Jews was near, and the next recorded events take place in Galilee and on into the region of Tyre and Sidon, and later on the Decapolis, Jesus' life story continues consecutive events when he begins his period of retirement, the way it's recorded. Well, if those events take place in that manner, and we understand it correctly, Jesus either went up to Jerusalem for the third Passover. There's not anything recorded about that in the Bible. I don't know. There's nothing recorded about him being at a feast of the Passover, the third Passover in his life, in his ministry, period of his ministry. Well, or he didn't attend the third Passover feast. And there's a lot of discussion about that. Debate if the Passover feast mentioned in John chapter 5 and verse 1, if that's not a Passover feast there, if it's another one, some scholars say it was the Feast of Purim, or maybe the feast in the fall celebrating the cleansing of the temple, or some other feast, then that shortens the ministry span of Jesus to just over 2 years instead of 3, just over 3 years. And so the opinion of scholars apparently weighs to the third possibility that it was a 3-year ministry. But I just like to be clear that, you know, that's not 100%. Yeah, but that's the way the scholars are. Let's look at some of the movements of Jesus in this period of retirement. You know, Jesus' home headquarters was Capernaum up here in the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And as he began his first retirement, he goes just across the north end over here to Bethsaida, Judas. And this first period of retirement is very short. He seeks to get away from the multitudes. He goes over there. The people follow him, and he feeds 5,000. And then he goes off in the evening to pray in the mountain. The disciples start back toward Capernaum in the boat, and they get held up. And Jesus walks on the water that night, and he meets the boat. And Peter says, "Let me walk with you," and he goes out and walks on the water a bit, and then he loses his faith in that, and then Jesus comes into the boat, and Jesus saves his life, I presume we could say, and then they end up back over on the west side. Over here at the plain of Gennesaret, and it's just south of Capernaum. And the people are thronging to meet him and be with him. And so they found out he was gone, and they all got in their boats and started going around the north end of the Sea of Galilee, and they catch up with him, and then he ends up in Capernaum. And so at the end of this first period of retirement, he ends up in Capernaum in the synagogue. And John chapter 6 records a long discourse of Jesus. And on Wednesday night, we were talking, Charlie was teaching the class about that discourse in Capernaum on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Well, let's see, maybe I need to go down. Okay, Jesus of Bethsaida, the apostles, when they returned, declared this day at the beginning of this period of retirement, Jesus had sent the apostles on the limited commission, and they came back and declared unto him what they'd been doing, and then they withdrew over to Bethsaida to begin that period of retirement, and then the 5,000 were fed, and Jesus goes along the mountain. John 6:15 tells us he perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him a king, and then he withdrew into the mountain himself alone. This is probably the height of Jesus' popularity among the masses. They're about to make him king. They want him to be king, a physical king, and over a physical kingdom. And of course, that's not Jesus' kingdom. As he told Herod, "My kingdom is not of this world." And so when he got to Capernaum the next day, after walking on the water, they came to Gennesaret, and then Jesus, and they got to Capernaum in John 6, and Jesus had his discourse there. And we know that he taught them about spiritual bread and spiritual life and spiritual terms, and they were worried about getting some more fish and loaves. And they were completely, most of them were completely out of sync with Jesus and his message. Just like one time Jesus mentioned something that could be referred to food, and the apostles were with him, and they were trying to go buy groceries. And he was talking about spiritual food. And so we have to be careful in our consuming of the Word of God, that we don't mix up physical blessings with spiritual blessings. You know, blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. And then Jesus promises what we need. You know, he says after the birds and after the flowers, and he blesses us with what we need to live. And we trust in that. And one old fellow, Roy Woods, that I knew most of my life, and he used to say you needed to pray like everything depended on God, and then work like everything depended on you. If that was the sequence of faith and actions in a man's life. But anyhow, these are some of the words that Jesus taught, and they didn't like it when he said you have to drink my blood and eat my flesh. He, of course, was not talking literally. He was talking spiritually. And they rejected those words because their mind was so stuck in this dimension, in this life, that they could not perceive that he was talking about spiritual life. And verse 64 there tells us the great fall. Some of you that believe not. And he knew from the beginning who they were that believed not, and who it was that should betray him. And then, of course, the next verse there mentions that Jesus understood that Judas Iscariot was the one to betray him. And so at this point in time, those folks turned from him and didn't follow him anymore. These sayings are too hard. Who can handle this? And so there's a point in the lives of people who hear the message of the gospel and hear the truth, whether they will handle that or not, whether it's acceptable to them or they turn their back on the words of God. And I'm sure those of us who are over 20 years old have experienced that with more than one person in our lives when you were talking to somebody and they said, well, you know, I had enough of that, you know, just get on with something else. Don't waste my time. I had one friend that died of alcoholism the last time I saw him, and I was trying to talk some sense into him. He said, Gene, you got your thing to do and I got mine, so leave me alone. And in 6 months he was a dead man. And so those things are difficult in life, but those are things that Jesus faced there in his life. Well, then after those that discourse in Capernaum and those turning away from him, the second movement in the retirement of Christ takes place, and they're in between the second retirement. Let me get on the right page with him. There was a visit from the criticizing Jews, and they came to see Jesus. They came from Jerusalem and criticized Jesus because this is chapter 7 of Mark, and we were talking about this at the end of Wednesday night class, how that they were trying to, they trusted the traditions of the elders more than they trusted the Word of God. And Jesus pointed out to them that washing with defiled hands didn't defile the spirit or the soul of a man. It was the things that came out of the heart that did that. And his example was, you have the law of Moses that says if you honor your father and mother, and of course that meant to physically support them as well as emotionally and treat them with respect, then that was their tradition was usurping the law of God. So which of these is worse? Eating with dirty hands that upsets the traditions of the elders, or breaking the law of Moses? It seems simple to us, doesn't it? The traditions of the Jews were so rigidly held that it was they could not see the significance of the error that they were committing, and it was so about so many of the minutia of the law of Moses. And Jesus said in one of the accounts here that you are expert in finding a way around the law of Moses, and so they were. Anybody have a question or comment about anything we've said so far this morning? Okay, then so you might turn over your Bible to Mark 7 and Matthew 15, and step Mark 7:24. The text says, from there he set out and went away to the region of Tyre, and he entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. And let me go back to the map. Should have put another one down there. But Tyre is up here, and Sidon is north in this Phoenician coast here. And it's known in the Roman times that we're talking about in the first century is Syria right here, and it was another area that had its own appointed leaders, political leaders, military leaders. So Jesus now, as he begins his second retirement, leaves Capernaum down here and goes up here. It's a couple of days journey up in this area, and then as he travels from here, he will go over into the area of Decapolis, and he will be back at the end of that tour. He'll be back over here on the west side of the Sea of, I believe that says Dalmatia right there. He will end up there in the third movement of the retirement. So you see the area he's covering is farther away from Jerusalem down here by the in this area. He's staying out of Judea, and he's staying up there, and the discourse between Jesus and the Pharisees becomes harder as he addresses them. Generation of vipers, hypocrites. He calls them to their face, and when he pointed out, you're overthrowing the law of Moses with your traditions, that is a slap in the face of the religious authority of the Jews. And I don't think, if a person got up on Sunday morning and denied Christ in front of the auditorium, might, it might compare with that action of Jesus with those religious authorities. They would take that as unlawfulness, defiance, anything. It would anger them so much, and they were plotting to kill him. You know, on one occasion, the Jews in Jesus' hometown were plotting to kill him. And the Pharisees, as time goes on from the beginning of the ministry, began to figure that getting rid of him was the best way, because they didn't want to stand up publicly in front of the masses that were accepting Jesus, but they had to do it more subtly than that to keep from losing face. And so even after the crucifixion of Jesus, they tried to bribe the guards to say that his body was stolen. So their position politically and religiously, they were, how did Jesus describe them? They loved the marketplaces and to make broad the phylacteries of their garments and be called by the masses master, teacher, and so on. And this was a great insult to them. Jesus telling them the truth about their position before God. And so this period of retirement extended the period of time before it came to the culmination. And the second, let's go back down the page again now. The period of retirement began around the third Passover, and the end of the period of retirement is marked by the Feast of the Tabernacles. 4 months later, it's in the spring, May, June, Passover, in the fall, October for the Feast of Booths, and the Feast of Atonement, and some other important feasts of the Jews. And that time period there, about 3 or 4 months, was his retirement was the borders of that would be the third Passover and the Feast of Booths in that October. And then at the Feast of the Booths that October, Jesus was back in Jerusalem having confrontations with the Jews there on that occasion. And then he left Jerusalem once again, and then toward the Passover feast, he began his journey back to Jerusalem for the last time in the spring of the year. So this is the last year of Jesus' life, and these 4 months from June to October, 5 months, with the borders of the retirement period. Do y'all understand what I'm saying about that? Say May 15th to October 31st in a period of time. And so Jesus is in and out of Galilee, and he's trying to stay away from the head-to-head confrontations, it seems, with the Pharisees. Yet on this occasion we're talking about in Mark 7, they came seeking him, and he told them their problems, and they didn't like that. And then so he came to Tyre and Sidon, and the story we have from this period is he heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Patty, read Mark 7:24 through 28. It will be that event.
From there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. He entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden, for For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. And she answered and said to him, Yes, Lord, even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs. Then he said to her, For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter. And when she had come to her house, she found the demon gone and her daughter lying on the bed.
All right, she was a Syrophoenician because she was from the area of Syria that we pointed out a few moments ago, in the area of Phoenicia, and so she was not a Jew. And of course, Jesus pointed out a few times that his blessings and his coming was to the Jews first. On the limited commission that he sent the apostles on, he said only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so the children were to be fed first, and you know, it's difficult language to call somebody a dog. Even today, that wouldn't be appreciated. But this woman she had a mission in mind, and that was getting some peace for her daughter, to get the demon out of her. And Jesus rewarded her for that faith that she had. And so we don't know a whole lot then about what Jesus did in those areas, and we don't know the exact length of time, days, weeks, that he was in that area. It's 2 or 3 days journey on foot to go from there, the Sea of Galilee, North Sea of Galilee, up into that area. And then it says in verse 31 of Mark 7 there, he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon. So he went, since Tyre is south of Sidon, he went north away from the Sea of Galilee on his first movement. And then it says he went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. So he made a little circle loop at the top and came back down, and the Decapolis is on the east side of the River Jordan and the Sea of Galilee. And what is some of the history of the Decapolis, Richard? It's how it got its name.
From the Decapolis is a Greek word, and it was, I think, founded during the time of Alexander's conquest through the area. It became Roman at the time that the Romans took Pompey to Jerusalem the first time. It was not Jewish population. It was really the tribes that gave Israel the most trouble during the Old Testament period, along with Moab and Edom. So they were Canaanite in their history.
Yes, and there were 2 of the tribes that had land in that area after the land was taken, and they seem to have been absorbed by the people. At the time of the New Testament, there were a group called Hellenists, and most of them came from the area of the Decapolis, because those there were 10 cities that Alexander the Great had built, and that the Greeks kept up when they were still dominant in that area before the time of Christ and before Rome. And they held on to Greek traditions and that kind of thing. And so the Hellenists that are mentioned in the book of Acts are people from that area, and they had that Greek culture still in them after all those years had passed. And so it's a large area, and the particular places, individual spots that Jesus visited there are few. And so he goes, we just read Mark 7:31 through 8:9 is a passage that talks about his third retirement, and Matthew 15:29 through 38. The Decapolis, and he went out from the border of Tyre and came through Sidon of the Sea of Galilee through the midst of the borders of Decapolis. Dalmanutha is that place on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And there's another place there that's mentioned in the New Testament called Magadan. It's another little small settlement over there on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, which is a lot more familiar territory to us in the life of Christ. And so Jesus departed Tyre and Sidon and came nigh to the Sea of Galilee, and he went up in the mountains and sat there. And so in that area, on that trip, he feeds 4,000 people. Mark chapter 8, I turn over there, and I think we got enough time to cover this. It's one record of feeding the 4,000, and similar to the 5,000. And he also healed a man with a speech defect in that area. Landon, read begin Mark 8, verse 1, and read the first 10 verses. Oh, Landon just stepped out. I'm sorry. Farron, read that. I missed that.
In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I send them away hungry to their own houses. They will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar. Then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness?
Let me interrupt you here, as Philip would say. Why should the apostles be surprised that he can feed them in the desert with rocks if he needed to?
They should not.
They should not have been surprised.
Yeah.
Go ahead, continue.
Okay. Then his disciples answered him, how can we satisfy these people? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. They set them before the multitude. And they had a few small fish. And having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000. And he sent them away, and immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha.
Dalmanutha is the best I can do with that.
Dalmanutha.
All right, so he got in a boat, and he was on the east side of the sea, in the area of the Decapolis somewhere. Specifics, we don't know about that. Fed these 5,000, and he came back across the sea to the west side of the Sea of Galilee. We got a couple of minutes. I think it's important that we recognize in the discourse between Jesus and the Pharisees, And there's a point in here when a group of Sadducees come to him after the end of this third retirement. And that's the first time the Sadducees had directly approached him. It had been the scribes and Pharisees up to that. And so they began to pressure more. He gets more pressure from the religious leaders, and the dialogue becomes sharper between them until we get to Matthew, the 24th chapter, when he condemns them for most of the chapter there. Woe unto thee, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, you do this and do that against the law of God. And so Jesus is in control of the time factor when he is going to be crucified, and he begins to tell his, during this period of time, he begins to tell his apostles. He asks them some hard questions when in the discussion in John 6, when the people turned away from him, he turned to his apostles and said, do you also go away? Well, he got the right answer. Peter said, to whom shall we go? You've got the words of life, and they had that right. And so that, here they are, his closest associates on this world, and did he have doubts about him? Was he instructing them when he asked that question? And that would be, if I was somebody's best friend and they expressed doubts about me, I might have my feelings. We all can understand that. I don't think Jesus was trying to hurt their feelings. I think he was trying to instruct them that they had decisions to make and it was going to get harder. And as time passed, Jesus would say, I'm going to Jerusalem and this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be mistreated by these authorities. And of course, Peter on one occasion said, no, not you, Lord. He was ready to go fight and cut somebody's head off. And I think on that occasion is when Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. So the apostles began to hear firmer instructions, and the Jewish leadership began to attack him harder, and he began to talk firmer to them. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong at all about what Jesus said or how hard he talked to them. They deserved to hear what he had to say, and that it didn't do any good for that. But I think it's important. The time frame, if we buy into the 4 Passover chronology of the life of Christ, then that last 6 months before the crucifixion at the last Passover is an important place to pay attention to the what Jesus says on every occasion and how he was responded to by the crowds. Anybody have a last question or comment? All right, well that ends our class time. I believe Philip will be back for class next Monday, barring any difficulties.